Well, hello model car fans. Welcome to the Muscle Car Modeler. My name is Raul, and this week I'm going to feature a build here. This is a GT40 Mark II. Now, with the GT40s, when they got to racing, they started off with the 289 versions, and those, they were just calling them the GT40. They didn't call those the Mark I until the Mark II came out. So this one is a Mark II, which is a 427 car, big block car. The Mark Is are small block cars. There's also a Mark III and a Mark IV. Mark III being a small block street car, so few of those are made, and Mark IVs are another big block but a different kind of a car. But Ford was getting a little more aggressive, and they were trying to get a little bit more of an advantage, so they started looking at what happens if they took the Mark I car and stuffed a 427 in it and wanted to see what was going to happen and how it was going to do. So they first started doing this in late '64. Now those cars are very interesting, and they were doing a whole bunch of different things. So if you look at the very early cars, some of them have really long noses. They had different setups for aerodynamics because that was a big heavy motor and it offset the balance. And the small block cars were running really well, but they really were thought that the big block was going to be much more competitive. So they were trying to figure that out, but they had a whole bunch of problems doing that, and it was taking a while for them to iron them out and get the car to be competitive. But Ford was trying. They were jumping into their arsenal. The 427 was a very proven engine when it came to drag racing, and it was doing very well in NASCAR. It was a very competitive motor, and it was doing really well. But to have it race 24 hours, NASCAR, we're talking 4 or 5 hours, really fast, really high RPM, but that motor didn't have to last as long as it does in 24 hours. Now, 24-hour race, it's not just 24 hours. We're talking, testing, 4 or 5 hours of testing, 4 hours or so of qualifying, plus, a lot of teething. So we're talking 36 hours, I read, was a rough estimate on how these motors had to last, to compete with run race. So there was a lot that they had to do to this motor. Now, the 427 was a pretty well proven motor, but they had to do a couple of things. One, they wanted to lighten the motor up. So one of the things they did to do that was they switched to aluminum heads. The NASCAR engines were running iron heads, and they were running about 550 horsepower. On these, they put the aluminum heads on it. They dropped the compression to 10 to 1 instead of 12 to 1. I think it was like 10.5 to 12.5, but they dropped it 2 points. And that was due to the different fuel that they were allowed to run in Le Mans. In the endurance racing, I was reading that it was like 101 octane was what they were limited to, and NASCAR was running like 102, 103. I kind of find that strange that there was that much of compression difference between the two race fuels that was allowed in the different endurance racings and different classes. But that's just part of it and part of the deal. So they dropped the compression, and the valves got just a tiny bit smaller. They also put like a 780 single 4-barrel carb on these. So they limited it a little bit there, but they were not really interested in maximum performance. They wanted this motor to survive. That was the main thing. It's like, all right, we really need, what can we do to make this motor very competitive, but it needs to survive. These motors were not really known for their high RPMs, especially in the endurance racing where we've got these trick smaller motors that can really wind up. Now in NASCAR, they were running on about 7,400 RPM, but they were discovering that they didn't really last long term with that setup. So they're like, all right, we found the sweet spot was right about 6,200 RPM, where they still made plenty of torque, plenty of power. It was limiting it a little bit, but the motors were lasting. If they kept the RPMs down to about 6,200, which is what Ford was pushing, the motors would survive. You can get 7,000, 7,400 RPM out of it, but we're not talking, the whole 24 hours. You might get a half an hour, really just really accelerated the wear and tear on the motor at those RPMs and the oil consumption. That did have an effect on it. And also, all of this extra weight and extra torque was really beating up the transaxles. They just were not surviving. So, Ford had their 3 teams. They had the Shelby team working on it. They had the Holman and Moody team, which is kind of interesting that they brought some NASCAR guys in to race in endurance racing. And some people thought, okay, what do they know? They don't know the same things we do as far as endurance racing, which was what Shelby was really into. And then the newcomers recently developed Carcraft division so that they had their racing help, but Ford can watch them closely. So that was a fairly new development, and they were helping with the GT40 as well. Matter of fact, they figured out and designed and built the whole new 4-speed transaxle, which could handle the torque and everything, and that transaxle was able to survive. Holman and Moody and Shelby was figuring out the suspension and geometry and how to get the car to handle, because these things, if you had them set up right, according to Ken Miles, they were a pleasure to drive. But if they weren't set up right, the suspension geometry and when it went through the bumps and dips could really dart the car in different directions. So he said it can be a nightmare. If it's not set up right, it can be a nightmare and it'll fight you the whole way. But if it's set up properly, it's a pleasure to drive. Now that's according to Ken Miles. And I guess there's a ton of truth to that, because between Shelby figuring those things out, Carcraft figuring out the transmission, and Holman and Moody figuring out some other things with the engine and setup, they didn't really work together, but Ford shared the information between the teams that could benefit everybody. So there was a lot of that going on. They started to get their much better look. This is what they mostly look like when they started to get these scoops back here and figuring out the aerodynamics and getting the thing to handle. But as I mentioned, the earlier cars had all kinds of different setups, longer noses, different rear setups, because it was an evolution. They were trying different things. That's what makes interesting to research these cars, is there's point of time as far as how it was and how the cars were set up. And this one is no exception. Matter of fact, this particular car has some very interesting history, the one that's replicating here. This is actually chassis P1047, and its very first race was these colors. It was at the 66 24 Hours of Le Mans. It was one of the 3 Shelby team cars. Shelby had brought 3 cars. Of course, you know, number 1 is the Ken Miles light blue car that led most of the race but placed second. The second car, I'll throw that box up. The second car was the number 2 car that actually won the race. And this is the number 3 car, of course, and the number 3 that's right on it. This is the third one that Shelby entered, and it actually qualified number 1, which is what this thing's significant for, but it did not finish the race. Unfortunately, it lasted about 17 hours, and then it had a mechanical failure. Some things will say mechanical failure. Other sites said there was a hole in a radiator, which is what took this one out. Now, I didn't know all of that when I bought this Fujimi kit. I strictly was looking for a Mark II, which is all I wanted to build. I had already built one Mark I, which was the later 68, 69 Gulf colored car. Can't quite remember which one I did first. I think I did the 69 car first, and then I did the 68 car. But this was the second one I've done, and I really enjoyed it. These are actually really easy to build, so if you know your Fujimi GT40s, even though they're curbside and there's really no motor in there, they're a pleasure to build, and I really enjoy them. They're just a little finicky sometimes getting the chassis into the body. But this one I had rebuilt. I built it once, almost 20 years ago, and then about 5-6 years, maybe longer, 7 years ago, the decals were starting to turn pink. Fujimi's decals aren't really the greatest, and I've noticed that. So I had the decals redone, and so now they're much more white, but they were redone. And I've had that happen a couple of times, so I'd redone it. Now, this particular car, chassis P1047, I mentioned it was a brand new car to go to the 66 24 Hours of Le Mans. And it wasn't the only one. Matter of fact, its twin 1046 is the actually winning car, which is the one I built here. I haven't built the other car. But both of these cars, it was their very first race ever, was going to the 24 Hours Le Mans in 66. Now, as I mentioned, that's the official winner. And then this car did not finish. But this car has an interesting history of itself. Now, as far as the chassis number goes, this one has a race history of 4 races. Not really the best of luck. In this race, it had a hole in the radiator, so it didn't finish. The second race was 67 Daytona race, and also had a mechanical failure. I believe it was through a rod that sidelined it for that race, so it didn't finish that race. Its third race was the 67 24 Hours of Daytona. Same thing, it was involved in an accident, and car was pretty beat up. And then there was a fourth race after that, which right now it escapes me, but same kind of thing. It did not finish that race either. It was a mechanical failure or something. I don't quite remember what that one was, but this chassis number has those 4 races. But when I talk about point in history, this is the 66 24 Hours of Le Mans, and this is actually the same car, chassis 1047, and this is how it appeared at the 67 Daytona race. Now, this, I'll get more into this one at a later date. There are a bunch of differences. You'll notice it has 2 carburetors instead of 1. It has a bubble in the back window. The scoops are gone here, but they are here. And there's a number of differences. And the rear tires got wider. This is what's known as a Mark IIB. Now, 4 of the Mark IIs were converted into Mark IIBs. And at that race, here's something else kind of interesting, that why I built this one. See how it says Mercury right there instead of Ford? That's the only race where 2 GT40s showed up and raced with the Mercury badge on them, where it has Ford on the rest of them. So there was one race where they both said Mercury. There was 2 cars that said Mercury. This one being a full 427 Mark IIB. The other one was a partial Mark IIB. And I do plan to build that car, and I have the decals to do it. But this is how 1047 appeared at 66 Le Mans. So yeah, they're both number 3, they're both red, and then the other 2 races it was blue. Now this car also has a very interesting history that came up much later, and there's a lot to cover in that one. Turns out there are 2 of these in real life now, and this happened in about 2005, 2004, and I remember it just came up that Meekum was selling chassis number 1047. It came up for sale, and it was unrestored, and as it appeared at its last race. And it was highly revered, and they thought it was going to be this really big, high-selling car. Somebody in Japan popped up and said, no, that's a fake. I have P1047, and I've had it for 30 years. And it's like, I don't know how you guys are claiming you're selling my car when I have this car. Of course, Meekum's like, wait a minute, there's a dispute over the history of this car, but the car was unrestored, still blue, and same kind of thing. It had been in the collector circuit, owned by the same guy for many, many years, well-known Pebble Beach car, and fully unrestored. So they're like, wait a minute, how could there be 2? The one in Japan's got to be a fake. Well, the one in Japan was a wrecked chassis tub assembly that the guy had bought in the late 70s, and he collected parts from other GT40s and restored it and had enjoyed it for 30 years or so. And then all of a sudden it's come up. Well, when all this happened, this was before the days of the internet and all that stuff. So this story fascinates me, but I have to sum it up real fast for you. So they start to like, all right, we need to research these 2 cars. And sure enough, it has the exact same chassis plate number on it. Now these aren't VIN numbers, so you can't say it's illegal, it's VIN swapped. No, it really wasn't. And then when they started to look in the history of the 2 cars and everything that's going on, and this is where race history sometimes isn't accurate, like it says the chassis number competed in these 4 races, and well, 1047 was known, there was another car that had vanished. Turns out one car is actually 1031 and the other car is 1047. Both of them were at the 67 Daytona race, which it appeared as this car, and they were, an accident, and many cars were actually wrecked at that race. So Ford put them back together, and they paid a lot of money for entry fees to the next race. Well, they had already paid for chassis 1047 to go to the next race. So what did Ford do? Apparently they took and made a whole nother plate and attached it to the other car that was in much better shape, put that number on it, and it went to that race, and that was the unrestored car. So when they really started to look at the unrestored car, A lot of the suspension had parts from 1031, and it was so much of it. It was like, wait a minute, tons of this stuff is from 1031. So how is this the unrestored 1047, one of the premium ones, and was really untouched? Still had the tires from that last race in '67. Was really not driven. Like, how does this one have so many parts from 1031? Yes, we know there was an accident, and we know they just grabbed parts, put them all back together. These teams had 4 or 5 cars, and they put them all back together. And that car went from Shelby to Coleman and Moody, so they did bounce around between the different teams as well. Even though the teams had 3 or 4 cars, that car didn't always stay with that team. So as it turns out, that one really was 1031, but it was always known as 1047 because it had that plate on it. So when they started to look at the paint, they found an area and they scraped, they checked the paint and they peeled some of the paint because each race it got a different paint scheme. So they had found that it had the paint schemes, and then when it got to '67 Daytona, it had the paint scheme for that, but then under that, it had other paint schemes that predated when 1047 was actually made. 1031 was an earlier car and had been to other races. It had some of those paints under it as well. So like, it is definitely chassis 1031, and now it is chassis 1047. So they're like, all right, now we know the true history, which one is real and which one is not. They ironed it all out, and it was interesting. And they're like, well, we can't really say it's fraud when Ford is the one who actually did that, and they did that in '67. And there wasn't really anything illegal about it, because that's not a VIN number. Those are strictly, just chassis numbers they assigned to the cars to keep track of them as far as racing. But these things were never really meant to be sold and tracked, and that really wasn't a VIN number. These were just race cars, and they were going to be discarded. So it's quite interesting reading about all of that. So, these cars, you start getting farther and farther into them, you start to learn more and more stuff about them, and it makes each one unique. So then, while technically I've built that same chassis twice now, but 2 different cars, 2 different specs and different races. So there's a lot of differences. I'll get more into, the specifics of what they did to a 427 Mark IIB car versus a Mark II when I get into the video on that one. But I really enjoy these, and I've still got a number of them that I built. And I love these Fujimi kits, even though they really don't have an engine. You can put engines in them, but I haven't gone that far. I've just enjoyed them out of the box, and they look great. But like this one, I redid the red, I had the decals redone, and now they're much more white, and it just looks so much better. And this one's gotten a few trophies showing it as well. I'll post some of those pictures at the end of this video, as it's getting kind of long, but it's just a lot of history on a wonderful model kit that I really enjoyed building, and comes out really awesome. And just an easygoing kit to build for the most part. And I really like these for the simplified detail, even though they're getting kind of expensive, but they just go together really well. And it's funny, one of the shows I brought it down to Tucson to an IPMS show, and one of the judges told me, he goes, it's a beautiful build, but you didn't place, you got honorable mention because it's too shiny. The race cars were not this shiny. And I thought that was kind of odd, to tell me that. And I'm like, well, I just like my cars super clean, super shiny, more of, a museum piece and over restored. And that's just my personal preference and how I like them. And I understood the feedback on that. But, I'm like, all right, this is kind of weird to, usually you hear that the super shiny glossy paint job will get you every time, because that draws you in. When you're at a show, if the paint looks super great, it draws them in, and you look at the rest of the details. So I do know that the paint jobs really do have an effect, but that was just kind of one of the first times like, wait, what? It's too shiny? I lost because it's too shiny? And it's just a fun story as far as that goes. But that's plenty on that one. But these are really good kits. I'm going to do a little group one for you. Squeeze these in and get them all in there. But I featured that one before, and I'm featuring this one, and I'll get to that one eventually. I've got plenty of GT40s, and you've seen a couple others on my channel. But I love these cars. But the more I read about them and the specific stories, the more I want to do this one or do that one, and it gets me motivated to do a specific model. Even though when I originally bought this one, I did it strictly by box art and looks and price. I really didn't care specifically about the info. I didn't discover some of this stuff out until I was building it or rebuilding it or reading about other GT40s. So that makes it kind of fun for me as far as all of that goes. So thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and all your comments, and hit that bell button so you can get all my latest uploads. And I really appreciate it. And you guys, you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next Saturday.